Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Reboot. This is episode 2 and we'll be talking to my special guest about the subject of the Man of Steel himself. We're talking about Superman. Today I'm joined by Mr. Tyler Smoot. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
It's good to have you on the show, talk about a subject that we enjoy, watching the films, reading the comics, seeing the cartoons from, and seeing what's happening in Hollywood as far as the remakes of this. Already we've had a kind of a remake, or let's say a sequel, called Superman Returns,
right.
And we'll be discussing that a little, and we're now anticipating, is it this summer?
Yes,
This summer we're going to have, summer of 2013, another reboot to Superman called Man of Steel. Okay, so we've got a new director brought in, we've got we've got upgraded special effects, so this episode's kind of looking towards what's happening with that. Of course, we can't review that because it's not happened yet, but we could talk a little about between the Christopher Reeve versions of Superman and the Superman Returns. So just tell our audience and me a little about maybe your experience with both the comic book character Superman, the films, anything that's gotten your interest in this character.
Well, actually, Superman was the first comic book character I was ever introduced to. I remember it was actually the first movie I remember checking out from the library.
Really?
And it was the original Superman the movie. And from there, of course, there were the Superman cartoons that would come on after school, also with Batman.
Yeah.
And then that kind of opened the doors into the other comic book characters that were around at that time. I remember watching the Spider-Man cartoons and the X-Men cartoons and that sort of thing. And then I followed the movies, of course, and then recently, like you said, Superman Returns came out, and that kind of piqued my interest again, because here's a movie I'm going to be able to see in theaters rather than renting it on DVD or whatnot.
Right.
So that's where we are. And I was into the comics not so much as a kid. I had a few odd comics here and there, but I really didn't get into collecting comics until in college. I had a friend that asked me if I wanted to go to a comic book store one day, and I said, well, sure. And that started my graphic novel collection.
Yeah, okay. And so, of course, Superman has such a long, storied past. I mean, has he been around since is it even the 30s or 40s?
Yeah, I think the first appearance was in 38,
okay.
Which, from what I understand, he was basically the first superhero that had appeared in comic books, so he was kind of breaking new ground as far as that goes.
Right. Yeah, showing off this just an idea of super strength. Now his character, of course, had a backstory, an origin story, right?
Right.
Yeah, and go ahead with that.
Right, and it's what we know today as far as he was an infant that was rocketed from the planet Krypton as it blew up. Although I don't think the planet was actually named until later, so it was just this nameless planet off in space. And he came to Earth, and then he didn't, like we discussed before, he didn't have the same powers that he does now. It was kind of downplayed. He did have super strength, but it was fairly limited as to what we see today. And I think he couldn't fly.
Okay.
He could jump fairly long distances, but he couldn't fly.
Really?
And I'm trying to think. I think he still had his X-ray vision, but that was basically it. And then the other powers came down the line through the years with different comic book writers and that sort of thing. But he really started out pretty simple.
Yeah, so later on, I think the strength just kept going up, and up, and it's this just like the ability to fly up and away with his powers. He started to develop what else? The super breath.
Yeah, and then the X-ray vision.
X-ray vision, or
the laser vision.
Laser vision, exactly.
Vision.
Yeah, and so even the movies took some liberties away. I'm not sure if in the comics was the memory erasing kiss that he gave Lois in the second film.
I think that was definitely a film invention.
Definitely something just for the movies.
Right.
Comic books are kind of laughing at the movies at that point, probably.
Right.
But even then, you and I got the chance to watch the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, and it's interesting because, as we were watching this, and I was remembering back from my childhood, watching the first Superman. Of course, that's a Richard Donner film, and the second one, there's a storied, there's a story around the fact that Richard Donner, as the director, was not the director for the entire feature. Correct?
Right.
Yeah, he was let go or fired or whatever happened, had a disagreement, and so the film was finished by someone else. And that's the film that a lot of us know growing up. And then we got to see what he had intended as far as the storyline of that, and it's nearly an entirely different movie, isn't it?
Right. A lot of the basic story beats are there, but as far as filling in the details, it was very different.
Yeah.
He had a much different idea of how things should have gone.
Yeah. And that memory erasing kiss is completely gone from
Right.
it. Yeah, that was probably the other guy who thought of that
Right.
one. But, it tried to, I think, get back to what the first film had tried to do, is create a character who, of course, has a love interest in a human being, Lois Lane. And, of course, Lois Lane's right from the comics, always someone to get in trouble so she can be rescued, right?
Right.
Yeah, because that's her whole purpose, is to just get in trouble so she can be rescued. But beyond that, the idea, I think, of the superhero like this, what are some of the archetypes that maybe people don't quite know about Superman? Of course, he's got a fatal flaw, right? He's got one
Right,
weakness.
the kryptonite.
Right, which basically floors him.
Right.
Because we can't just have a superhero with unlimited strength. He's got to have some sort of weakness, and I think that plays into, making a much more interesting character. So the difference between Superman, the Richard Donner, let's just take maybe the first two films, because 3 and 4, there were 4 films made, and a lot of us who were watching probably didn't either see 3 or 4, or saw them and realized they were kind of
Right.
a joke.
We can forget them.
Yeah, let's just put those aside and say Superman 1 and 2, and then Superman Returns.
Mm-hmm.
How did you think the two compare with each other?
I thought that it was very interesting what Bryan Singer, the director for Superman Returns, I thought it was very interesting what he intended to do, because he didn't want to do a reboot.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to stay true to the feeling of the first films, but he also kind of wanted to put his own spin on things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just interesting how you can see callbacks to the first 2 films in Superman Returns, but it's also kind of its own entity in a way.
Yeah.
A lot of the characteristics of Superman are still the same, but he's obviously in a different world because we've gone modern.
Right.
In Superman Returns, so there's that definitely puts a different spin on things.
Yeah, because what year did these original films, approximate years?
I know
80s?
it was late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
Were the first 2 films.
Yeah, and the Returns, I think, 2006.
Yes.
So obviously, you've got to superimpose some of 2006 as far as hairstyles and
Right.
Some technology that's part of it. So it's not exactly easy to just transport this character and say there was just a small amount of time off and expect to believe that it just works in continuity. It's
Right.
There's a lot of things that I remember watching it in the theaters and saying, I do remember seeing these first 4 films, and I'm thinking I'm missing a movie somewhere, right?
Right.
Because, how does it begin? He's gone off.
Right, he's
hasn't
off
he?
in space, and so for the first, 20 minutes, there's no Superman in the Superman movie.
Right, and he returns just on a meteor again, the same way he kind of arrived.
Right.
And so I was thinking, again, are we rebooting the series again from the very beginning? But shoot, we saw just Lex Luthor a minute ago, so that doesn't make sense. And we realized, well, he'd left for a while, came back, and now he's having to deal with the fact that Superman's been absent from the world for X number of years, however long it's been.
Right, and people have kind of moved on.
Yeah, even Lois. Yeah, and then another spin, of course, being on that, Lois Lane has kind of moved on into another relationship. She has a son now, without giving away too much, but I hopefully, if you're watching this today, that you've seen it, that she has a son, and we realize that, towards the end of it, that, well, of course, this is Superman's son.
Right.
So, do we think that maybe that has come from, of course, the love relationship that Lois had in Superman 2? I guess, is that what they were trying to go for?
I think so. It's interesting because it's kind of a sequel, like we've talked about, but it's also kind of a remake and kind of a reboot because it fits into all those categories. Because a lot of, like I was talking about earlier, with the differences between the Donner cut and the original Superman 2 cut that most people have seen, the story beats are there, but there are just little differences because I know. In the first Superman movie, obviously the way that he's introduced is there's a helicopter that's going to crash and he saves Lois Lane. Well, something similar happens in Superman Returns because there's that the airliner that she's on.
Right.
And that's how he's kind of reintroduced as a superhero. So again, you could see that as maybe a remake or not necessarily a reboot, but so basically, is it a remake or is it a sequel? It could be either.
Let's talk
and
about
both.
Yeah, exactly. It's either or, but yeah. So he's introduced in that amazing, visual effects, pleasing scene of that plane crashing and saving Lois and all of that. I even think that's probably what most of the trailer was made of for Superman Returns, is seeing that scene. But let's go back to the original '80s films and say, what were the strengths? What did it really have that set it apart from other movies during its time? What is it that caught our eye? What is it caught that caught your eye?
For one, I think the music. I mean, the Superman theme is iconic, and that's what I'm interested to see what they do in the new movie, because they're not going with John Williams. They're going with something completely different. So I'll be interested to see that. But it really set it apart as far as, here's a superhero, he has his own theme, that things are going to get exciting because here's the music. So I think it had that going for it. And Christopher Reeve, I mean, a lot of people said he was just the embodiment of Superman at that time, which I think he really was. He really worked as you believed that he was the character. Yeah. So I think that was a really big strength that those movies had going for them.
Yeah, he didn't try to choose scenery. He wanted to play the part as if he really was that role without being too over the top. And I think people can get that way when they become the superhero, puff out their chest, and become that. And he didn't, and he paid respect to this. I think going into the project, an actor could say, well, this is beneath me. I'm not really, I'm so much better than this. And he went in there, I think, taking it seriously, understanding the vision Richard Donner had for the character, and just delivered upon the expectations. Let's talk about maybe Gene Hackman. How did you like him as Lex Luthor?
He was interesting. I mean, that's part of the movie that a lot of it, interestingly enough, for a comic book movie, was pretty serious. But that part was pretty campy. Gene Hackman as the villain was pretty campy. He did well. Don't get me wrong, but it was, like you said earlier, he was definitely chewing scenery.
Right, yeah, and I completely agree with that. He's being Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor, because I don't think the comic book character, of course comic books can't speak to us, but in a lot of ways they can as far as developing a character, but that wasn't the same kind of Lex Luthor as the comics portray him, correct?
Not really. I know probably around the 60s or 70s, things were kind of silly
really
in the comics, but I know the more recent iterations of Luthor have been really straightforward. His sole purpose was he thought he could be better than Superman, and so he wanted to get rid of Superman. Yeah, which happens a little bit in the movies, but he's more kind of bumbling, I guess.
And his role in the movies, it seems like he doesn't have this personal hatred towards Superman. He's just trying to take over the world, or he's just trying to have the power.
Right. He's almost kind of like a Bond villain in a way. And
Superman's just getting in his way.
Right.
Yeah. Is that the same as the comics, or is he...
Not Not really,
Yeah.
because Lex Luthor in the comics was more ruthless, more calculating.
Yeah.
Which, to a certain extent, the Gene Hackman Lex Luthor was,
Yeah.
but he was more about real estate.
Yeah,
and
okay.
that sort of thing.
Right, and we discussed this, of course, talking about Superman Returns, with the addition of Kevin Spacey playing Lex Luthor, which we keep wanting to say Kevin Spacey playing Gene Hackman. Oh no, I mean Kevin Spacey playing Lex Luthor.
Right.
What do you think about that? Did he play? Did he play too much to the Gene Hackman isms?
Well, right. I think he played Gene Hackman.
Yeah.
I don't know that he played Lex Luthor.
With the screaming, with the over-the-top acting.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. He was definitely playing that role. I don't think we disagree on that. And
No.
I don't think the fan base disagrees on that.
No.
Back to the old movies. You say, of course, John Williams, doing that music. Richard Donner as the director, of course. Have you seen any other Richard Donner films that maybe stick out in your mind that, I don't put you on the spot here as far as directors are concerned.
Right.
But
No, I know he did Lethal Weapon.
okay. Right. Yeah.
Which is really different from Superman.
Right.
But I mean, still, I think that shows he's got a real range as a director. He's not like he could have just gone on to do just superhero movies or something like that. But
and Goonies too, as well. I think
Okay.
he did the original Goonies, so he also can play up to children. Of
Right.
course, watching these films, because you can enjoy these films, especially the Richard Donner films. As a child, I did. As a child, growing up, and still can enjoy these films even as
Yeah.
an adult. And so I think that really works on that as far as him as the director. Bryan Singer, what do you think of him as the director?
I think I've been really impressed with a lot of the things Bryan Singer's done, because he basically led to the resurgence of comic book movies with the first two X-Men movies.
Mm-hmm.
Up to that point, we'd had Superman and Batman, which had gone on for a while and become pretty silly.
Yeah.
But Marvel hadn't really thrown their hats into the ring, so to speak, until Singer came out with the X-Men movies, and everybody was just floored with that. And then we saw the floodgates open, and then every comic book character got a movie.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Right, and then a lot of people don't realize that, because X-Men 1, I think, was in the 2000 kind of region there.
Right.
Is when it came out, and then, like you said, the floodgates open. Now we've got all kinds of Marvel comic movies coming out, and Spider-Man, and even Spider-Man being rebooted again.
Right.
Fantastic Four we talked about, they had 2 films, now they're getting another reboot. Incredible Hulk, of course now we have $200 million movie like the Avengers. So, in DC and Marvel, a lot of people don't realize maybe the difference between the two. Because as far as DC is concerned, we've got Superman, Batman, Green Lantern. Am I missing any of that have had film releases?
As far as film releases,
Recent,
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that DC being the competing company with Marvel, X-Men, Avengers, Hulk, all of those guys, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man. Am I missing any there? Of course, I know Thor, Iron Man, Captain America.
Sure.
I think that's about as what we've heard. I mean, which has been plenty, and some of them have had their own sequels.
Right.
As part of that too. And of course, Wolverine, and being a spin-off of the X-Men, and then now we're having X-Men First Class.
Right.
There's another X-Men coming out, right?
Right.
Yeah. In fact, Bryan Singer, I think, is part of that too, right?
Yeah, he's actually come back to direct this next X-Men movie, which I think is really interesting. From what I've been reading, there's going to be some time travel involved. Well, not necessarily time travel, but alternate timelines, so that they're actually going to try and... Because if you look at the X-Men films as they were, and then X-Men First Class, they don't necessarily line up.
They don't do that, yeah.
But I guess they're going to address that in the next movie and try to bring them more in line.
Okay.
Through maybe some time travel or alternate universes or something like that. So
they'll make it work, of
Right.
course, and they'll give it the budget to make it work,
Right.
won't they? Share with us a little of what you've brought as far as collectors. Of course, the last a couple episodes I've had to show off some of my collection, but we have the Blu-ray.
Okay,
let's
yeah,
go ahead
this
and
is
see this.
we watched the Donner cut of Superman 2, and this set actually includes the first movie that we've been talking about as well, Superman the movie, and then Superman Returns. And I think they've put all these together because, like we've talked about, they kind of go together. Yeah. Whereas Superman 3 and Superman 4 didn't necessarily follow in this timeline.
Yeah.
So I think that's why these are packaged together.
It's a good idea.
In this Blu-ray collection. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I brought was Superman: The Man of Steel, the graphic novel.
Let's hold that up so we can see.
Sure.
Yeah, see. It's a neat comic.
The interesting thing about this is that I think it was in the mid-'80s sometime, like we were talking about before with the alternate universes and things like that. DC had done that so much that there was so many continuity problems and everything. They said, okay, we need to streamline everything. Yeah. So they had this big event where basically all of their universes were destroyed. Well, not necessarily destroyed, but merged into one.
Okay.
And so this is where that picks up. This is the origin of Superman.
Right.
After that point. So for the modern audience, this is where Superman started.
Okay.
And I mean, DC's done reboots to their comic line, over and over. So at this point, it's old hat. Yeah. But this was really big.
So if I were to, let's say, I wasn't into comics, and I was definitely not into reading any Superman comics, this graphic novel might be a good starting point for me.
Right. It would be a good jumping in point. Now, like I said, they've kind of done other reboots through the years, and I think I haven't been following DC as much recently, and I think they've done another reboot just within the last few years, so there's going to be a new origin, probably. But as far as like getting the basics of the character, this would definitely be good.
Okay. What else have you brought?
And then the other thing I brought was a really big story that most people know Superman from was the death of Superman.
Okay.
Which the interesting thing about this is, as far as I know, this was the first time a major comic book character had been killed. Mm-hmm. I know Captain America's partner was killed really early on.
Yeah.
In the comics, but that was in
Minor.
the 30s, 40s,
sure.
And it wasn't really a big deal. But this was Superman.
Sure. Yeah. The first superhero in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, he didn't stay dead for long. No comic book character ever does. But it was just interesting that DC, had the guts to kill off their main character.
Yeah.
Like I said, even though he did come back,
sure.
It's just a really gutsy move.
Yeah. Why do you think they went through this? Was it maybe with the plans of bringing him back, or what do you theorize that they had in mind for him with this?
I would imagine that they were probably testing the waters.
Okay.
I would have been really surprised if they had, if their initial thought was to make it permanent, because just in a business sense, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Superman's going to bring in a lot of money. But I think it's just really to pique readers' interest. Like, oh, this is interesting. Let me check this out. What's going on here? And then, you get more money for more readers.
Yeah.
So.
And what year do you think did this come out, you said? Or?
This was the early 90s.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly what year, but early 90s.
I do remember the news coming out about this. I mean, it was it was definitely heard around the world, even at the early stages of the internet. I mean, even at that time, and not everyone had internet access, so, newspapers and television shows were all putting out this news story of the death of Superman, and I remember that, and I'm like, how in the world can they do that?
Right.
But now we're kind of understanding why reboots exist, essentially, because, and I didn't bring this up with Blake in the last episode, but even Rick Berman of the Star Trek series has said franchises can get fatigued over time.
Definitely.
Yeah, because even fans of Superman, after a certain point, it's the same story over and over again.
Right. What else new can we do at this point?
Right. So we got to do something, maybe, like you said, test the waters, maybe shake them up a little bit. And I go back to Coca-Cola. What did they do? They came out with New Coke, and, and that was really just to put us back to Coke Classic, to say, we weren't going to get rid of your old formula. We were just going to see if you appreciated that a little bit more by doing this. So did they, so in that case, did they come up with a new universe of Superman, or did he come back from the dead? Is that the idea?
It's been a while since I've read this story, but from what I remember, everyone thought he was dead, and by all accounts he was.
Okay.
But somehow, and this is the part I don't remember. Somehow he got back to his Fortress of Solitude, and he was actually only in a very deep coma.
Okay.
And so he had to take time to kind of regenerate, I guess. And then he was back in action. So, but as far as everybody else was concerned, he was dead.
So any sci-fi, fantasy, trope that we can throw in there to bring him back,
right,
they would pull it off, because you can't keep the Man of Steel down, right? Yeah, and you got to milk this franchise for all it's worth, and that's fine. I guess I'm fine with it. Mm-hmm. Fan bases and there's definitely something to it, because why would we, have this 2013 movie coming out called Man of Steel, and then giving it a big budget? Who do we have as the director? I think
the director is
Zack Snyder, right?
Zack Snyder
from 300.
Right, he did 300. He did Watchmen. He did the Dawn of the Dead remake.
That's right. Yeah.
Sucker Punch. Trying to think if there's anything.
Well-rounded director. Good choice, I think, for this reboot. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, he's shown that he can revitalize a series and take, of course, graphic novels like 300. It had that comic book style to it. So it'd be interesting. And have you seen the trailer yet for the Man of Steel? I'm sure you have. Yeah. It's definitely got his touch on it, doesn't it?
Right. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of action, because he's a very action-oriented director.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, a good character-driven director as well. So we'll see how that all plays out. And I think you might find it interesting. I had the chance to meet Michael Uslan, who is the executive producer of the Batman films, everything from the Tim Burton Batman to the Dark Knight series that we have now. And he was mentioning how getting on with DC as a producer of the comic series of Batman, and actually teaching, believe it or not, a comic book course at Indiana University Bloomington. Wouldn't that be a great course to have?
Yeah, definitely.
I would sign up. I went to Ball State, so we didn't have that. But he mentioned, taking the story of Superman is kind of superimposing this story of Moses. Moses, oppression was happening. All the firstborn boys were being killed, and so in this case, like Superman, his planet, it was being destroyed, and they send Moses down the river in a raft. Mm-hmm. Okay, and we take Superman, and we've got the superimposed story of Moses right on top of that. Isn't that neat?
Yeah.
How whoever was the original creator of Superman was able to to draw that that storyline from something that was already familiar,
right,
to something that was a little bit more modern.
Right, because everyone already knows this story. We can make a different character that basically follows the same thing.
Yeah, and make it relatable,
right,
in a sense. So we're about out of time here. So I just appreciate you coming on board to tell us a little about this, enlighten us a little on both the films. We're looking forward to that Man of Steel film. I'm
Definitely.
sure. Yeah, when it comes out, then we'll be out there seeing it. They talked about 3D or IMAX. I'm not sure.
I'm sure it will be at least an IMAX, if not 3D.
Yeah, so definitely going to have to see that in the theaters when it comes out. So thank you so much, Tyler, for being our guest today on Reboot.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been great talking with you. And thank you for joining us today. Hope that we've entertained you a little about this. We look forward to the next film coming out. And thank you for watching this episode of Reboot, and we'll see you next time.